The sound of muffled sobs echoing through his barn at midnight made Wyatt Carrington's blood run cold, because in 23 years of ranching, he'd learned that tears in the darkness usually meant someone was either dying or about to be killed. Lightning split the Wyoming sky as Wyatt pushed through the heavy wooden doors, his boots silent on the hay-strewn floor. The autumn storm had been brewing all evening, and now it unleashed its fury across the Carrington spread with the kind of violence that made even seasoned ranchers pray. But it wasn't the thunder that had drawn him from his restless sleep. It was the sound of a woman's broken heart spilling into the night. There, huddled in the corner stall where his prize mare usually stood, was a young woman he'd never seen before. Her dark hair hung in wet tangles around her shoulders, and her simple traveling dress was torn at the sleeve. She couldn't have been more than 22, with the kind of delicate features that belonged in a parlor, not a barn. Yet here she was, clutching a leather satchel to her chest like it contained her very soul. "Miss." Wyatt's voice was gentle, the way he'd learned to speak to spooked horses. "You're trespassing on private land." She looked up with eyes the color of stormy seas, and Wyatt felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with fate. Fear radiated from her like heat from a branding iron, but underneath it, he saw something else. Determination. The kind that got people killed in this territory. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain hammering the roof. "Don't let my father in." The words hit him like a physical blow. Wyatt had been raising his 8-year-old daughter Sadie alone since his wife's death 3 years ago, and he knew the sound of a child's terror, even when it came from a grown woman's lips. This wasn't just fear. This was the kind of bone-deep dread that spoke of years of running. "Your father?" Wyatt kept his distance, hands visible and empty. "Miss, I need to know who you are and what kind of trouble you've brought to my land." She stood slowly, unfolding like a flower that had been pressed too long between book pages. "My name is Eliana Fletcher. I was a student at the Teachers College in Cheyenne." Her voice grew stronger with each word, as if speaking her own name gave her power. "My father is Grayson Sawyer." The name hit the air like a curse word. Everyone in Wyoming territory knew Grayson Sawyer, railroad baron, cattle king, and the kind of man who crushed anyone who stood between him and what he wanted, including, apparently, his own daughter. Sawyer's girl. Wyatt's mind raced through the implications. "I heard tell he was looking for a runaway bride." "That would be you, I'm guessing." Eliana's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Bride," he promised. "Meet a Hunter Finley, that snake oil salesman who owns half the gambling halls in Denver." The marriage contract was signed before I even knew about it. She touched her throat, and Wyatt noticed the faint marks there, like someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave bruises. "I was supposed to be grateful. A business arrangement, he called it. Like I was just another head of cattle to be traded." The storm outside seemed to echo the fury building in Wyatt's chest. He'd seen too many women treated like property, too. Many lives destroyed by men who thought money gave them the right to own another human being. His own wife had fled an arranged marriage before she'd found refuge in his arms. "So you ran," he said. "I graduated yesterday. Top of my class." Pride flickered in her eyes like candlelight. "I was supposed to come home and announce my engagement to the whole territory. Instead, I climbed out my bedroom window and rode 12 hours through this storm to get away from him." Thunder crashed overhead, and Eliana flinched. In that moment, Wyatt saw not just the frightened woman, but the brave girl who'd chosen freedom over security, who'd ridden through a Wyoming storm, rather than surrender her dreams. "What's your plan now?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I don't have one." The admission cost her. He could see it in the set of her shoulders. "I just know I won't go back. I won't be sold like a prize heifer at market." Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and Wyatt made a decision that would change everything. His ranch was remote, but it wasn't hidden. If Sawyer was looking for his daughter, he'd find her here eventually. And when he did, Wyatt would have to choose between the quiet life he'd built for himself and Sadie and the right thing to do. "Miss Fletcher," he said carefully, "my daughter's asleep in the house. You're welcome to shelter here until the storm passes, but I need to know, what happens when your father comes calling? Because men like Grayson Sawyer don't just let their property walk away." Eliana's chin lifted, and for a moment, Wyatt saw the steel beneath the silk. Then I suppose we'll find out what kind of man you are, Mr. Carrington. The challenge in her voice stirred something in him that had been dormant for too long. He'd been so focused on being a good father, a steady provider, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to want something or someone with the kind of desperate intensity that made a man willing to fight the world. Lightning illuminated the barn in stark white, and in that moment, Wyatt saw his future stretching out before him like a dangerous trail. He could play it safe, send her away come morning, and return to his quiet life. Or he could step into the storm. But as he opened his mouth to answer, the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats thundered up his drive, and Eliana's face went white as winter snow. The hoofbeats weren't Grayson Sawyer's. They belonged to something far more dangerous. Point three riders emerged from the storm like harbingers of hell itself, their faces masked by rain and shadow. Wyatt recognized the lead horse immediately, a massive black stallion that belonged to Easton McAllister, the most feared bounty hunter in the territory. If Sawyer had hired McAllister, then Eliana wasn't just running from an arranged marriage. She was running from a man who'd rather see her dead than free. "Get behind the feed bins," Wyatt whispered, his hand moving instinctively to the colt at his hip. "Stay low, stay quiet." Eliana's eyes went wide with terror, but she nodded and disappeared into the shadows like smoke. Smart girl. Wyatt had seen what McAllister did to people who crossed his clients, and it wasn't pretty. The barn doors burst open with a crash that made the horses whicker nervously in their stalls. McAllister stood silhouetted against the lightning, water streaming from his long coat, his pale eyes scanning the interior like a predator seeking prey. Behind him, two hired guns flanked the entrance, their hands resting on their weapons. "Carrington." McAllister's voice was smooth as silk and twice as deadly. "Beautiful night for a ride, don't you think?" "I think it's a hell of a night to be trespassing on a man's property," Wyatt replied, stepping forward just enough to draw attention away from where Eliana was hidden. "What brings you to my spread, McAllister?" The bounty hunter smiled, and it was like watching a snake prepare to strike. "Oh, I think you know exactly what brings me here. Or should I say who?" He pulled out a daguerreotype from his coat pocket, a formal portrait of a young woman in a high-collared dress. Even from a distance, Wyatt could see it was Eliana. Pretty little thing, isn't she? Worth quite a bit of money to the right man. "Haven't seen her," Wyatt said flatly. "But if I had, I'd remember. A face like that tends to stick with a man." McAllister's laugh was like breaking glass. "Now see, that's where we have a problem. Because I've been tracking her for 2 days, and her trail leads right to your front door." He stepped closer, his boots echoing in the sudden silence. "You know what I think? I think you're lying to me, Carrington. And I take that personal." The air in the barn grew thick with tension. Wyatt could feel his heartbeat in his throat, could smell the metallic scent of impending violence. He'd been in situations like this before, during the war, when he'd ridden with the Colorado cavalry. But this time, he wasn't just fighting for his own life. He was fighting for Eliana's freedom, and somehow, that made all the difference. "I think you're mistaken," Wyatt said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "But you're welcome to search the property. Just remember, this is my land, and I don't take kindly to folks who overstep their bounds." McAllister's eyes narrowed, and Wyatt saw the calculation there. The bounty hunter was weighing his options, deciding whether to push the confrontation or play it smart. Finally, he nodded to his men. "Spread out. Check every stall, every corner. She's here somewhere." As the hired guns moved deeper into the barn, Wyatt's mind raced. He needed a distraction, something to buy time. That's when he heard it, a soft whimper from the direction of the house. His blood ran cold. "Daddy." Sadie's voice cut through the storm like a knife. She stood in the doorway connecting the barn to the house, her small frame dwarfed by her white nightgown, clutching her rag doll to her chest. She'd been awakened by the commotion, and now she was exactly where Wyatt had prayed she wouldn't be. McAllister's attention snapped to the little girl, and his smile turned predatory. Well, looks like we have ourselves some leverage. You touch her, and I'll kill you where you stand," Wyatt growled, his hand moving to his gun. The threat wasn't empty. He'd die before he let anyone hurt his daughter. "Easy now, McAllister," said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No need for violence." Yet, he crouched down to Sadie's level, his voice taking on a sickeningly sweet tone. "Hello there, little darling. Has your daddy had any visitors tonight? Maybe a pretty lady who needed a place to hide." Sadie's eyes went wide with confusion and fear. She looked between McAllister and her father, clearly not understanding what was happening but sensing the danger in the air. I, I don't know," she whispered. "That's okay, sweetheart," McAllister said, standing slowly. "But see, I think your daddy does know, and I think he's going to tell me, or things are going to get very unpleasant for everyone involved." The barn fell silent except for the drumming of rain on the roof. Wyatt felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. He could give up Eliana's location, save his daughter from whatever McAllister had planned. Or he could fight and risk everything he'd built, everything he loved. That's when he heard it, a soft rustling from the feed bins. Eliana was moving, and McAllister's men were getting closer to her hiding spot. In seconds, they'd find her anyway. "Daddy," Sadie whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "I'm scared." The words broke something inside Wyatt's chest. His little girl shouldn't have to witness this. She shouldn't have to live in a world where men like McAllister preyed on the innocent. But that was the world they lived in, and sometimes a man had to choose between safety and what was right. "I know, sweetheart," he said softly, his eyes never leaving McAllister's face. "But sometimes we have to be brave, even when we're scared." McAllister's smile widened. "Touching, really, but I'm running out of patience. Carrington, where is she?" The bounty hunter's hand moved to his gun, and Wyatt knew they were out of time. Whatever happened next would determine not just Eliana's fate, but the kind of man his daughter would remember her father to be. But before anyone could draw, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "I'm right here." Eliana stepped into the lamplight like a ghost materializing from shadow, her chin raised in defiance despite the terror radiating from her every movement. The torn sleeve of her dress had been hastily pinned, and her dark hair was braided back with the kind of severe practicality that spoke of a woman preparing for battle. "There she is," McAllister purred, his hand relaxing away from his weapon. "The prodigal daughter returns." But Wyatt saw something in Eliana's eyes that made his blood run cold. Not just fear, but a desperate kind of calculation. She was planning something, and whatever it was going to get them all killed. "I'll come with you," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Just leave them alone. They have nothing to do with this." McAllister's laugh echoed through the barn like breaking glass. "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, sweetheart. See, your daddy's been very specific about his instructions. He wants you brought back alive. Yes, but he also wants to make sure you understand the consequences of running." His pale eyes shifted to Wyatt and Sadie. "And nothing teaches a lesson quite like watching innocent folks pay for your mistakes." The words hit the air like a physical blow. Wyatt felt his daughter's small hand slip into his, her fingers ice-cold with terror. This wasn't just about bringing Eliana home. This was about breaking her spirit so completely that she'd never dare to run again. "You're lying," Eliana whispered, but her voice cracked with doubt. "Am I?" McAllister pulled out a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Contract's right here, signed and sealed. $5,000 for your safe return, plus an additional $1,000 for every person who aided in your escape." His smile was pure poison. "Your father's a thorough man. He knows exactly how to ensure loyalty." The barn fell silent except for the storm raging outside. Wyatt felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him like an avalanche. He'd thought he was protecting a young woman from an unwanted marriage, but this was something far more sinister. Grayson Sawyer wasn't just controlling his daughter. He was systematically destroying anyone who might help her. "There's something else," Eliana said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Something you don't know about why I really ran." McAllister's eyes narrowed. "I'm listening." Eliana looked directly at Wyatt, and in her gaze he saw a plea for trust that went deeper than words. "My father didn't just arrange my marriage to Hunter Finley. He arranged my mother's death." The words hung in the air like a curse. Even McAllister's hired guns stopped moving, their attention drawn by the raw truth in her voice. "That's a serious accusation," McAllister said slowly. "Aurora Coleman was my mother's name before she married my father," Eliana continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "She was a teacher, just like I wanted to be. She had dreams, plans for her life that didn't include being a railroad baron's trophy wife. Her hands clenched into fists. 3 years ago, she started talking about leaving him, about taking me away from Wyoming territory and starting over somewhere he couldn't find us. Wyatt's chest tightened. The story was hitting too close to home. His own wife had run from an arranged marriage before finding refuge in his arms. But she'd been one of the lucky ones. 2 weeks later, she was thrown from her horse. Eliana said, her voice breaking. Strange thing, though, my mother was the best rider in the territory. She'd been breaking horses since she was 12 years old. But somehow, on a calm Tuesday morning, her mare spooked and threw her against a tree. The implication hung in the air like smoke. McAllister's expression had grown cold, calculating. Murder was one thing, but killing a man's wife was a line that even hardened criminals hesitated to cross. You have proof of this? He asked. Eliana reached into her satchel and pulled out a leather-bound journal. My mother's diary. She wrote everything down, his threats, his violence, his promises of what would happen if she ever tried to leave. She opened the book to a page marked with a ribbon. Listen to this. Grayson says if I ever take Eliana from him, he'll make sure I never see another sunrise. He's already proven what he's capable of with the Morrison family when they defaulted on their loan. The Morrison family. Wyatt remembered that name. An entire homestead had burned to the ground 5 years ago, killing everyone inside. The official cause had been listed as an accidental fire, but there had been whispers, rumors of something more sinister. She was going to expose him, Eliana continued. She had evidence of his other crimes, the loan sharking, the claim jumping, the families he'd driven off their land. But she never got the chance. McAllister's face had gone pale. Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't this. He was a killer, yes, but he was also a businessman. And smart businessmen didn't get involved in the kind of scandal that could bring down a territorial governor's investigation. Why should I believe you? He asked, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Because, Eliana said, there's a second diary, one my mother hid before she died, and it contains everything, names, dates, proof of every crime Grayson Sawyer has committed in the past 10 years. She met his eyes directly, including the names of everyone he's hired to do his dirty work. The silence that followed was deafening. McAllister's hired guns were looking at each other nervously, clearly understanding the implications. If Eliana was telling the truth, then they weren't just involved in a simple kidnapping. They were part of a conspiracy that could hang them all. Where is this second diary? McAllister asked quietly. Eliana's smile was sharp as a blade. Safe. Hidden where only I can find it. And if anything happens to me, if I disappear or die mysteriously, it goes straight to the territorial marshal. In Cheyenne, the bounty hunter's hand moved to his gun, but Wyatt saw the hesitation in his eyes. This had just become far more complicated than a simple retrieval job. You're bluffing, McAllister said, but his voice carried no conviction. I. Eliana stepped closer, her fear replaced by something far more dangerous. The fury of a woman who'd been pushed too far. Try me. But before McAllister could respond, the barn door exploded inward, and Grayson Sawyer himself stepped into the light, his face twisted with rage and something that looked almost like madness. Grayson Sawyer stood in the doorway like a monument to corruption, his silver hair slicked back despite the storm, his expensive suit somehow untouched by the rain that had soaked everyone else. But it was his eyes that made Wyatt's blood run cold. The flat, dead gaze of a man who'd crossed lines so many times he'd forgotten they ever existed. My darling daughter, Sawyer said, his voice carrying the honeyed poison of a snake oil salesman. You've caused me considerable trouble. Eliana stepped back instinctively, her newfound courage wavering in the face of the man who'd haunted her nightmares for years. Father, did you really think you could run from me? Did you think I wouldn't find you? Sawyer's smile was razor sharp. I own half of Wyoming territory, girl. Every sheriff, every judge, every man with a badge answers to me. His gaze swept over Wyatt and Sadie before settling on McAllister. What's taking so long? I told you to bring her back, not host a tea party. McAllister shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering near his weapon. There's been a complication. Mr. Sawyer, your daughter has made some interesting claims. Claims. Sawyer's laugh was like breaking glass. She's always been prone to flights of fancy. Too much education, not enough discipline. He stepped closer to Eliana, and Wyatt saw her flinch. But that's about to change. Hunter Finley is waiting at the ranch with a preacher in a wedding dress. You'll be married by sunrise, and then we can put this unpleasantness behind us. No, the word came out stronger than Eliana had intended, and she straightened her shoulders. I won't marry him. I won't be your bargaining chip anymore. Sawyer's mask of paternal concern slipped, revealing the monster beneath. You'll do as you're told, or I'll make sure your new friends here understand. The price of defying me. His eyes fixed on Sadie, and the threat in them was unmistakable. Pretty little thing. Reminds me of you at that age, before you started getting ideas above your station. Wyatt stepped forward, placing himself between Sawyer and his daughter. Touch her, and I'll send you to hell myself. Brave words from a dirt farmer, Sawyer sneered. But you have no idea who you're dealing with. He gestured to the men behind him, not just McAllister's hired guns, but 3 more riders who'd arrived with him. I have 6 armed men. You have what? A rusty old Colt and righteous indignation. The barn had become a powder keg, and everyone in it knew that the slightest spark would set off an explosion that would leave bodies scattered across the hay-strewn floor. Wyatt's mind raced through his options, but every scenario ended the same way. With Sadie caught in the crossfire, that's when Eliana made her move. You want to know about claims, father? She said, her voice carrying across the barn like a clarion call. Let me tell you about Aurora Coleman's second diary, the one that details every murder, every bribe, every family you've destroyed. She pulled a small leather book from her satchel, different from the one she'd shown before. The one that names McAllister as the man who killed the Morrison family. McAllister's face went white as fresh snow. You're lying. Am I? Eliana opened the book and began to read. August 15th, 1871. Grayson hired that bounty hunter McAllister to burn out the Morrisons. Said they were late on their loan payments. But I know the truth. They found gold on their land, and he wanted it. Should I continue? The silence that followed was deafening. McAllister's hired guns were looking at their boss with new eyes, clearly understanding that they'd been dragged into something far worse than a simple kidnapping. Even Sawyer's men were shifting nervously, their loyalty tested by the implications of what they'd just heard. Enough, Sawyer roared, his composure finally cracking. I don't care what lies you've written in that book. You're coming with me. And that's final. He nodded to his men. Kill the rancher and his brat. Make it look like they resisted. But McAllister held up a hand, his pale eyes fixed on Eliana. Wait. He turned to Sawyer, and for the first time, there was something like fear in his expression. If that diary is real, if it contains what she says it does, then what? Sawyer snapped. You're afraid of some scribbles in a book. I'm afraid of a noose, McAllister replied flatly. And so should you be. The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Wyatt saw his chance and took it. Sadie, he said quietly, never taking his eyes off Sawyer. Remember what I taught you about the root cellar? His daughter nodded, her small face pale but determined. She understood when he gave the signal. She was to run to the hidden passage that led from the barn to the storm cellar beneath the house. It was their emergency plan, one they'd practiced but never hoped to use. You think you can protect her? Sawyer asked, drawing his own weapon, a pearl-handled revolver that had probably never been fired in anger. You think your pathetic heroics will make a difference? I think, Wyatt said, his hand moving to his Colt, that some things are worth dying for. Thunder crashed overhead, and in that moment of deafening sound, everything happened at once. Sadie bolted for the hidden passage, her small form disappearing into the shadows. Wyatt drew his gun, diving behind a feed trough as bullets began to fly. Eliana clutched the diary to her chest and rolled behind a hay bale, her heart hammering against her ribs. But it was McAllister who changed everything. Instead of drawing on Wyatt, he turned his weapon on Sawyer's men, his face set with the grim determination of a man who decided to cut his losses. Nothing personal, he said, and pulled the trigger. The barn erupted in chaos. Gunfire lit up the darkness like deadly fireworks, and the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and fear. Horses screamed in their stalls, and somewhere in the distance, Wyatt could hear Sadie's voice calling for him. But as the smoke cleared and the echoes of gunfire faded, one terrible truth became clear. Grayson Sawyer was still standing, and he had Eliana at gunpoint. The pearl-handled revolver trembled against Eliana's temple as Grayson Sawyer backed toward the barn door, his expensive suit torn and bloodied from the gunfight. Around them, the carnage told its own story. Two of his men lay motionless in the hay, while McAllister crouched behind an overturned feed bucket, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder. "Stay back," Sawyer shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'll kill her. I swear I'll kill her before I let her destroy everything I've built." Wyatt kept his Colt trained on the man, but his heart was hammering against his ribs. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation, and Eliana would be dead. The woman who'd ridden through a storm to claim her freedom would die in his barn, and he'd be powerless to stop it. "You don't want to do this," Wyatt said, his voice steady despite the chaos raging inside him. "She's your daughter. She's a liability," Sawyer snarled. "Just like her mother was. Aurora thought she could cross me, and look where it got her. Lying in a grave with a broken neck." The admission hit the air like a physical blow. Even in his desperation, Sawyer couldn't help but gloat about his crimes. It was the arrogance that had made him powerful, and now it would be his downfall. "You hear that?" Eliana said, her voice surprisingly calm despite the gun pressed to her head. "He just confessed to murder. In front of witnesses. Witnesses who'll be dead in 5 minutes," Sawyer replied, but there was something hollow in his voice now. The empire he'd built on fear and violence was crumbling around him, and he knew it. That's when Wyatt heard it, the sound of riders approaching at full gallop. But these weren't more of Sawyer's men. These were the reinforcements he'd been praying for. "Territorial Marshal," a voice called from outside. "This is Marshal Violet Drake. We have you surrounded." Sawyer's face went white as he realized the truth. McAllister must have sent word to the authorities before coming to the ranch, probably as insurance against exactly this kind of situation. The bounty hunter was many things, but he wasn't stupid. He'd known that Sawyer's crimes would eventually catch up with him. "How?" Sawyer whispered. "Insurance." McAllister called from his hiding spot, his voice thick with pain and dark satisfaction. "I've been keeping records of all your jobs, Sawyer. Every murder, every bribe, every family you've destroyed. You think I'd work for a man like you without protecting myself?" The barn door burst open, and Marshal Drake entered with her deputies, their badges gleaming in the lamplight. She was a tall woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much violence, but her presence filled the barn with an authority that even Sawyer couldn't ignore. "Let her go, Sawyer," she said, her voice carrying the weight of territorial law. "It's over." For a moment, Wyatt thought the railroad baron might actually surrender. But then he saw the calculation in Sawyer's eyes, the desperate madness of a man who'd rather destroy everything than lose control. "If I can't have her," Sawyer whispered, "then no one can." His finger tightened on the trigger, and time seemed to slow to a crawl. Wyatt saw the moment of decision, saw the exact instant when Sawyer chose destruction over defeat. The rancher's Colt bucked in his hand, the shot echoing through the barn like thunder, but it was Eliana who moved first. Years of fear and rage finally found their outlet as she twisted in her father's grip, her elbow driving into his ribs with all the strength she possessed. The pearl-handled revolver went off harmlessly into the rafters, and suddenly she was free, diving away from the man who'd haunted her nightmares for so long. Sawyer staggered backward, clutching his side where Wyatt's bullet had found its mark. Blood seeped between his fingers, and his face was twisted with pain and fury. But even wounded, he was still dangerous. "You think this changes anything?" he gasped. "I own half this territory. I have judges, sheriffs, politicians in my pocket. You'll never make any charges stick." "Maybe not," Marshal Drake said, stepping forward with iron shackles in her hands. "But we'll sure as hell try." As the deputies moved to secure the scene, Wyatt felt a small hand slip into his. Sadie had emerged from the storm cellar, her face pale but determined. She'd heard everything, seen more than any 8-year-old should, but she was safe. That was all that mattered. "Daddy," she whispered, "is it over?" Wyatt looked around the barn, at Sawyer being dragged away in chains, at McAllister being tended to by a deputy, at Eliana standing in the doorway with the storm finally breaking behind her. Dawn was painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. And for the first time in years, The future looked bright. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said, squeezing her hand. "It's over." But Eliana wasn't looking at the sunrise. She was looking at him, and in her eyes he saw something that made his heart race faster than any gunfight ever could. It was hope and possibility and the promise of something new beginning. "What will you do now?" he asked her. She smiled, and it transformed her face completely. "I'm going to teach. There's a school in the next valley that needs someone who understands that education is about more than just reading and writing. It's about giving people the tools to build better lives. And after that, she said, stepping closer, I suppose I'll see what other dreams are worth fighting for." The barn had grown quiet except for the gentle sound of horses settling in their stalls. Outside, the wild roses that grew along the property line were beginning to bloom, their pink petals bright against the morning sky. It was a sight that would have seemed impossible just hours before. Beauty growing from soil that had been watered with blood and tears. 3 months later, when Wyatt and Eliana were married in the same barn where they'd first met, those roses formed her bouquet. And when people asked about their story, about how a single dad rancher and a runaway teacher had found love in the midst of violence and chaos, they would always mention the roses, because sometimes, in the wild country of the human heart, the most beautiful flowers bloom in the darkest soil. That if this tale of courage and love stirred your heart like a Wyoming wind, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories from the untamed frontier. And drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from today. We love hearing from folks all across this great land of ours.